Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
They called it a homecoming, but the second I pulled into the cracked gravel driveway and saw the way my father was already standing by the porch, arms folded like he'd been keeping watch for something he didn't particularly want to see again, I knew nothing about this visit would be anything close to welcoming. The house hadn't changed much. Same white paint that flaked like sunburned skin, same rust stains under the gutters, same sad, crooked porch swing dangling by one good chain and one fraying prayer, but everything else felt different. Smaller. Colder. The kind of place that looked like it remembered every silence ever shared inside it. I stepped out of my car, my boots crunching down on loose stones, the heat already sticking to the back of my neck. My father didn't walk over to greet me. He just nodded once, the same tight-lipped nod he used to give during parent-teacher meetings when he didn't agree with the teacher, but didn't care enough to say it out loud either. My mother came out of the house a few seconds later, wiping her hands on a dish towel that looked older than my college diploma, smiling that thin, tired smile she always reserved for moments that weren't about joy but about keeping the peace. I hadn't even closed the trunk before she was saying, "It's been too long," in a voice that suggested it was somehow my fault we hadn't spoken in over a year. It wasn't lost on me that no one offered to help with my bags. I hadn't planned to stay long. Maybe a week, two if I could stomach it. But when the phone call came last month, my mother quietly explaining that the house was in trouble again, that they might have to downsize if they couldn't get a little help, I'd felt the old guilt crawl back into my throat like it always did. I didn't tell them that the house had been mine for nearly 9 years, that I'd paid off the mortgage anonymously through a trust when they hit rock bottom the first time. I just said, "Of course I'll come," like the good daughter they pretended I was, like the daughter they could never quite manage to love the way they loved the others. Inside, the air smelled like boiled cabbage and some overripe fruit nobody had thrown out. My sister Casey was already in the kitchen, spoon deep in some casserole, her 3 kids running in tight circles like caffeinated tornadoes. She looked up at me like I was a relative from a foreign country she barely remembered visiting once. "Wow," she said flatly. "Lena's here. Didn't think we'd see you before Christmas." I smiled and said nothing because there was no point. My brother Josh showed up an hour later, carrying a 6-pack like it was a gift and not an accessory to his usual temper. He gave me one of those fake bro hugs, the kind where your shoulders touch but your hearts stay 10 feet apart. The night passed slowly. We ate lasagna, the same kind my mother used to make when she was trying to save money, no meat, just layers of overcooked noodles and canned sauce. My father sat at the head of the table like a king with a discount crown, holding court with bitter nostalgia and offhand judgments. He asked about my job without really wanting to hear the answer, made a crack about those tech people thinking they're gods, and then rolled his eyes when I said I didn't come back to talk about work. But I knew what this dinner was. It was a performance. One big awkward act where everyone pretended we were still a family and not just a group of people tied together by old habits and shared regrets. They all smiled, made small talk, asked shallow questions. Nobody asked why I left, why I stayed away, or how I managed to live a whole life without ever really calling this place home again. It was during dessert, the banana pudding, his favorite, that it happened. The moment that would undo whatever threadbare bridge we'd managed to build that night. My father, spoon halfway to his mouth, looked straight at me, that same smug grin playing at the corners of his lips like it always did when he was about to say something he thought was clever but was really just cruel, and said, "Well, you've worn out your welcome already, haven't you?" The room didn't freeze, it just hummed. That soft, awful tension where everyone knows something wrong just happened, but nobody wants to deal with it. My mother let out this nervous half-laugh, like maybe it was a joke, like maybe he didn't mean it. Casey stared into her glass of wine. Josh chuckled like the ass he always was and went back to eating. No one looked at me. I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. I just kept my eyes on my father and smiled. A different kind of smile. One he'd see again very, very soon. Because what none of them knew, not my father, not my siblings, not even my mother, was that the mortgage they were so afraid of losing again was already long gone. They hadn't owned this house in almost a decade. I had. And as I took one slow sip of lukewarm coffee and let the silence grow teeth, I started planning exactly how I'd remind them of that. And the best part? They wouldn't even see it coming. By the time the banana pudding hit the table, that dense, yellow mess of instant custard and soggy Nilla wafers topped with a thin skin of overbeaten meringue, the tension in the room had reached that particular pitch where it didn't need to be named anymore. It simply lived among us like another guest, lounging between place settings, licking its lips in anticipation of something no one had the courage to say, but everyone could feel pressing against the backs of their necks. The air was humid with July heat and the cloying scent of sweet, lukewarm dairy, and I remember thinking, oddly enough, that it smelled exactly like the Sunday afternoons I spent as a teenager praying for time to move faster. Praying for a way out of this house that always made me feel like I was both too much and never enough. My father, who had always treated conversation like a courtroom where he played judge, jury, and executioner, leaned back in his chair with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from believing you're still in control of a world that's already slipping away from you. He hadn't looked at me directly since the moment at dinner when he made his little quip, the one that, if you didn't know him, might have sounded like a harmless joke, something offhand, said to break the ice, to lighten the mood, but which I knew, from years of decoding the barbed wire of his humor, was a calculated dig meant to remind me of my place. "You've worn out your welcome already, haven't you?" he'd said, eyes gleaming like a man who's spent his entire life mastering the art of saying the cruelest things with a smile so polite it dared you to challenge it. No one at the table defended me. My mother, always the master of social smoothing over, pretended not to hear it, though I noticed the way her fork paused midair, the muscles around her jaw tightening just enough to betray discomfort before she reached for her wine with the sort of desperation that was all too familiar. My sister Casey, still pretending to be deeply engaged with her phone while her kids screamed about something sticky on the living room rug, didn't even look up. And Josh, of course, chuckled, because that's what Josh always did when Dad was being a prick in public. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because agreeing with the old man was easier than thinking for himself. I stayed quiet through dessert. I smiled. I played the part. I complimented the pudding, told my mother it tasted just like I remembered, even though what I remembered was scraping it into a napkin and flushing it down the toilet as a teenager just to avoid being accused of wasting food. And while everyone kept up the performance, Casey's kids wrestling over a tablet, Josh talking about some construction job he almost got, my father reminiscing about his high school football days like he hadn't done it at every family gathering since the Clinton administration, I sat there and let the silence inside me grow teeth. Because there's something about being humiliated in a house you paid for that changes you, something about being treated like a guest in the place that wouldn't even exist if not for your silent generosity, that burns hotter than rage. It calcifies into something quieter, more dangerous, like lava cooling into sharp, black stone. And as my father went on about how people don't know how to stick around when times get hard anymore, I realized he was talking about me. Again. Always. Because in his eyes, leaving this town had never been ambition or survival, it had been betrayal. He never understood why I left. Or maybe he did, and just couldn't stand the idea that someone might choose a life that didn't revolve around pleasing him. I moved across the country at 24 with nothing but a college degree, a busted Toyota, and a silent vow to never come back except on my own terms. For years, I struggled, couch-surfed, took jobs that paid in exposure and bad coffee, and never once asked anyone here for a damn thing. Then one day, the call came. The house was in trouble, the bank was circling, and I, out of a mixture of guilt, pride, and some pathetic hope that maybe this act of generosity would make them finally see me cut a check so large I had to wire it in pieces. I never told them. I never wanted thanks. I just wanted peace. But peace wasn't part of the bargain. I excused myself just before the coffee. I didn't slam my chair back or roll my eyes. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I stood up, placed my napkin neatly on the table, said I needed to get some air, and walked out the front door like someone whose patience wasn't just thin, it was already gone. Outside, the sun had set, but the heat still clung to the ground, radiating back up through the soles of my shoes like a warning. I leaned against the hood of my car, pulled out my phone, and opened the mortgage servicing app. I hadn't looked at it in months, maybe longer, because I'd buried that part of the story deep under layers of distraction and busyness and this constant, gnawing lie I kept telling myself that maybe, just maybe, they would come around if I just gave them enough time. But people like my father don't come around. They orbit their own egos until the day they die. I stared at the balance, $0, of course. It had been zero since the day I paid it off, though I'd kept the account open under my LLC's name for legal reasons. That house, the one they still believed they owned, the one they thought the bank had forgiven or forgotten or, more likely, that God had somehow spared, it was mine. All of it. Every nail, every creaking stair, every mildew-smelling cabinet. And I still held the power to take it all back. As I stood there under the thick, silent sky, one hand wrapped around the edge of the fender, the other still holding my phone, I realized something that made my stomach knot with clarity. I didn't want them to grovel. I didn't want an apology. What I wanted, what I needed, was to make sure they understood what they'd thrown away. Not just me, but every single opportunity they had to turn things around. Every moment they could have said thank you and chose instead to tighten the noose of resentment around their own necks. And now? Now they'd feel it. Not in a dramatic, explosive way. No, this was going to be slow. Precise. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Because if they wanted to treat me like a stranger, like some inconvenient charity case who had overstayed her welcome, then that's exactly what I would become, the kind of stranger who leaves behind silence and one hell of a bill. I spent most of that night lying awake in the narrow twin bed that still had the same faded quilt from my childhood, its once bright pinks and purples now reduced to a dull grayish palette that smelled faintly of dust, mothballs, and the kind of time that passes without anyone really noticing it's gone. The mattress dipped in the middle from decades of uneven sleep, and the ceiling fan above me made a faint clicking sound with every rotation, like a metronome counting down to some decision I hadn't fully admitted to myself I was already making. I could hear my parents murmuring across the hall, voices hushed but not soft, just distant enough that I couldn't make out the words, only the tone, and that was more than enough. It was the same tone they'd always used when talking about me, not to me, when I was younger, frustration wrapped in performative concern, the sound of people trying to convince themselves they were the victims of a problem they'd created. At some point, around 2 a.m, when the heat had settled thick into the room and I'd already stared at the same water stain on the ceiling for what felt like an hour, I got up. I moved quietly, not because I didn't want to wake them, but because it felt right, like some rituals demand silence, and this one, this late-night descent into the past, was exactly that. I opened the closet, not really expecting to find anything, just looking for something to hold in my hands that wasn't regret. I moved old sweaters, a high school prom dress, still encased in dry cleaner plastic, a box of unused holiday wrapping paper. Then, near the back, where the light didn't quite reach, I found it, an old shoebox, lid bowed slightly from age, marked with a strip of masking tape and the word Lena written in my mother's slanted cursive, a faded ink that looked like it had lost its conviction years ago. I carried it to the bed and sat down with the same kind of hesitant reverence one might have when opening a time capsule buried under a tombstone. Inside, it was a mess of old notes, school report cards, cards from birthdays I barely remembered, and folded-up drawings from kindergarten. There was a photograph near the bottom, one of the whole family at the beach, me in the middle, age 12 maybe, arms crossed and sunburnt, eyes squinting not from the sun but from something deeper, something that had already started hardening inside me. Someone, probably Josh, maybe even my father, had scratched a ballpoint pen through my face, not with violent force, but with lazy, repeated lines, like the act itself was just a distraction during a boring phone call. I stared at it longer than I should have, not because I was shocked, but because I wasn't. That's the part that stuck with me, the fact that I expected to find something like that. There were also letters, one from a guidance counselor who'd written a glowing recommendation for a scholarship I didn't end up getting, another from a roommate I'd ghosted after moving out of state, and one, and signed but unmistakably from my mother, apologizing in vague language for everything that happened during my senior year. I remembered everything well enough. It was the year I stopped trying to get their attention and started preparing to escape. The year I got into college early and my father refused to drive me to the campus tour because girls in tech were a waste of money and effort. The year I came home with a broken heart and no one noticed. The year I stopped telling them anything. It was there, sitting on that bed with the box on my lap and my childhood on full display in fragments and scribbles, that I felt the final thread between us snap, not with fury or drama, but with the quiet certainty of something that should have broken years ago. Because for all their talk of family, of roots and loyalty and tradition, the truth was that they'd only ever wanted me on their terms, and the second I deviated from the version of myself they were comfortable with, they chose distance over understanding, silence over growth. They didn't lose me. They let me go. And when I moved across the country and built a life for myself from the ground up, when I slept on friends' couches, ate peanut butter out of jars, worked unpaid internships while coding through the night, and slowly turned that grit into a real business, a real paycheck, a real name in a world they couldn't even begin to understand, they never once asked what it took. They just heard I was doing well and assumed it was luck or some undeserved opportunity handed down like a trophy. They didn't know that I had maxed out 2 credit cards to pay the property taxes that first year the house was in default. They didn't know that when the bank called me, not them, because I'd put my phone number on the paperwork when I started the trust fund, I answered in the middle of a meeting and said, "I'll handle it," without even checking my account balance. They didn't know that I'd cried afterward, not because I was overwhelmed, but because even then, part of me hoped that maybe this sacrifice would be the one they finally saw. But the truth is, they never saw me. Not really. I opened my laptop and logged into the mortgage servicing portal. It had been almost a year since I'd checked it, and even now, seeing the dashboard didn't feel real. The balance, of course, was still 0. The payments marked as current. The deed legally transferred to my holding company. My name was nowhere on the property records they'd received. They never bothered to look too closely, probably too grateful at the time to ask questions. They believed, in that magical thinking way people do when they've convinced themselves the world owes them something, that the house had been saved by divine intervention, or maybe a bank error in their favor, like some twisted Monopoly card come to life. But it was me. It had always been me. And now I was the one holding the knife. As I stared at the screen, cursor hovering over the lien cancellation section, a rarely used clause that allowed transfer of debt if certain legal boxes were checked, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel vengeance. What I felt was stillness, the kind of sharp, clear stillness that only comes after the last straw lands quietly and without ceremony. I didn't press the button yet. I just stared at it, knowing I would. Maybe not tonight, but soon. And when I did, it wouldn't be an act of cruelty. It would be an ending. One they earned. Morning came with the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but deliberate, like the house itself had agreed, in its own creaky way, to brace for something that hadn't yet arrived, but was already vibrating beneath the floorboards. The sun had barely begun cutting through the bedroom blinds when I sat upright in the narrow bed, sheets twisted around my legs like the remnants of a restless, half-lived sleep. And I didn't reach for my phone or stretch or yawn or do any of the small rituals people do when they're easing into the day. I just sat there, completely still, breathing in the same musty air I used to choke on as a teenager, and listened to the faint clatter of my father stirring in the kitchen 2 rooms away. The sound of a coffee tin being opened, a spoon scraping ceramic, the first deep groan of a drip machine that had outlived its welcome years ago, all of it so achingly familiar that for one tiny, fractured moment, I almost forgot what I'd come here to do. But then I remembered the look on his face, my father's face, at the dinner table the night before as he delivered that cheap little insult with the same casual cruelty he'd perfected over a lifetime, the way he made everyone laugh, even if it was nervously, even if it was forced, and the way not one of them, not my mother, not Casey, not even Josh, had looked at me, much less spoken up. It wasn't just about that single moment, it was about the decades leading up to it, the small humiliations that added up to an identity crisis, The way they always expected me to forgive without apology, to show up without invitation, to give without acknowledgement. And I'd done it. I'd given them everything. I paid off the house. I gave them the stability they had squandered through bad decisions and arrogance. And in return, I got banana pudding and a smile with a knife in it. So I stood up, stretched my arms until I felt the tight pull in my back from too many hours hunched over a bed that belonged to someone I hadn't been in a long time, and reached for my laptop. I sat cross-legged on the bed, the shoebox from the night before still resting beside me, its contents now strewn haphazardly across the comforter like the aftermath of some personal archaeological dig. I opened the screen, blinked into the glow, and typed in the login credentials to the mortgage portal with the kind of quiet purpose you see in people who've already made up their minds. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just resolve. There it was. The property listed in plain, emotionless text. 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch on 1/3 of an acre. Appraised value, significantly less than they thought. Lien holder, Lena Merrill Holdings LLC. Status, active. Paid in full. But here's where the part no one ever tells you about control comes in. Real control. Not the puffed-up kind my father mistook for manhood, but the kind that's written in legalese and buried in the back pages of signed contracts. Because when I'd paid off the mortgage, I hadn't just donated money and walked away. I'd bought the debt outright. I'd taken title through an intermediary holding company and structured the deed in such a way that the house technically, legally, and irrevocably belonged to me. I had let them believe they'd been saved by some financial miracle, allowed them to bask in the fantasy of a benevolent banker or a mysterious investor swooping in to keep their roof intact. And I never corrected them, because at the time, I didn't need the credit. I just wanted the silence, the lack of crisis, the simple relief of not getting another tearful phone call from my mother saying she didn't know what they'd do. But what I'd created was not a gift. It was a loan they never even knew they'd taken. And this morning, I was done pretending otherwise. The reinstate lien option wasn't flashy. It didn't come with sirens or flashing warnings or red text screaming, "Are you sure?" It was just a button. A quiet, gray rectangle nestled between legal disclaimers and links to downloadable PDFs. But it might as well have been a detonator, because what it represented was irreversible. Pressing it meant the mortgage would be reinstated at the original principal balance I'd paid, plus backdated interest at a legal minimum rate, enough to ensure that unless they came into an unexpected windfall, foreclosure would be a certainty within 6 months. There'd be letters. Then phone calls. Then, eventually, a notice taped to the front door like a scarlet letter. I didn't press it right away. I stared at the screen, letting the magnitude settle over me, letting myself feel the weight not just of what I was about to do, but of everything that had led to this moment. The resentment that had built like sediment over years of being made to feel like the outsider in a family I had supported from the shadows, the years of condescension, the clipped phone calls, the sarcastic jokes about how some people forget where they came from, and that particular brand of performative humility that always came with a subtext of disappointment. They didn't want me successful. They wanted me manageable. But I wasn't manageable anymore. I wasn't that girl with the calluses on her hands from stacking dishes in a backroom diner after school, hoping her father would say something kind for once. I wasn't the college student who smiled through tears during phone calls home just to keep the peace. I wasn't the woman who sent money in silence, praying for a scrap of recognition. I was the owner of this house. And I was choosing, finally, to stop paying the price for their comfort. I moved the cursor. I clicked the button. It took 3 seconds. The screen refreshed. The status updated. The lien was reactivated. And that was it. No alarms. No confirmation emails. Just a shift in the code of a database somewhere, quiet and final and clean. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was rising over the overgrown lawn, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalk and the chipped concrete of the front steps where my father used to sit and smoke after dinner, muttering about the cost of living and how people like us don't catch breaks. He'd be drinking his first cup of coffee by now, maybe still thinking about the way I left the table last night, maybe wondering if I'd already packed my things, if I'd be gone before he got the chance to make one last comment designed to wound. and I would be gone soon. But not before he understood the truth, not just about the house, but about me. Because this wasn't just about property or money or even revenge. It was about ownership. Of my life. Of the past. Of every inch of pain they'd handed me and called love. And now, finally, I was handing something back. Not in anger. Not in spite. But in perfect, deliberate silence. The kitchen was already warm by the time I stepped into it, that specific kind of stale warmth you only find in old houses with too much linoleum and not enough insulation, the kind that holds on to heat like it's hoarding secrets. My father was there, of course, perched at the head of the table in that same chair he'd always claimed as if it had been passed down through some unspoken patriarchal lineage. The same chipped mug in front of him filled to the brim with coffee brewed too strong and bitter enough to match the lines in his forehead. He didn't look up immediately when I entered, which didn't surprise me. He was never one for greetings unless they were performative, the kind meant for guests or neighbors he wanted to impress. For me, it was always a nod, sometimes not even that, like presence alone should be enough recognition between blood. I crossed the room slowly, deliberately, my footsteps soft against the scuffed linoleum that had seen better decades. I poured myself a cup from the pot black, no sugar, no cream, just the way I'd taught myself to drink it in college, when every penny mattered and the taste didn't, and sat down across from him. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, sipping from identical chipped mugs. The only sound the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the old ceiling fan above us that still spun like it was doing penance for a house full of unspoken things. He finally looked up, eyes narrowing slightly like he was trying to read something written behind my forehead. "You heading out early?" he asked, and the words came out casual enough, but I could hear the edge beneath them, the same tone he used whenever he wanted to imply disappointment without having to commit to it fully. I nodded, took another sip, and let the silence stretch long enough to force discomfort into the room like a third cup on the table. Then, without any ceremony, without raising my voice or even looking directly at him, I said, "I canceled the mortgage." At first, he didn't react. Not really. He blinked once, then again, as if he thought he might have misheard me. He set his mug down slowly, carefully, and leaned back in his chair like a man who'd just felt the ground shift beneath him but wasn't ready to admit it. "What the hell are you talking about?" he said, and the calm was already cracking in his voice, spreading like spiderwebs across glass. I looked at him, not coldly, not cruelly, but with the kind of clarity that comes only after a lifetime of blurred lines and blurred roles, and said, "You never owned this house. Not since the foreclosure scare 9 years ago. I bought the debt. I paid off the balance. You've been living here under my name, through a trust one created just for this. You didn't save this house. I did." The silence that followed wasn't the awkward kind. It was sharp, dense, the kind of silence that reconfigures the very shape of a room. He opened his mouth, closed it again, reached for his mug, then stopped halfway like he couldn't trust his hands anymore. "That's not possible," he said, though it came out less like denial and more like a prayer. "It is," I said, still calm, still sipping. "And yesterday I pressed a button. The lien's reinstated. Back payments are due. Interest included. You'll get a letter from the bank in a few days. Might want to start looking for a place." I expected rage, or at the very least some performance of it, the kind of explosion he used to unleash on us as kids when the bills were overdue or the car needed repairs or my mother left the laundry too long in the washer. But what I got instead was something far more satisfying: disbelief. A man who'd always believed the world was tilted in his favor suddenly finding himself sliding backwards without a handrail. His lips moved, but the words didn't come out fast enough. He looked like a man trying to swim in molasses. You can't just do that. This is our house. I built this." "You built nothing," I interrupted, and for the first time, I didn't soften my voice or dull the blade. "You let it rot. You let it go. And when it was about to be taken from you, I stepped in not because I owed you anything, but because I thought, stupidly, that maybe saving the place would mean saving something between us." I stood, left my coffee on the table untouched. He didn't follow. He didn't yell. He didn't even ask me to stay. That was the final confirmation I didn't realize I still needed. He wasn't angry because I'd betrayed him. He was angry because he could no longer pretend he held any power over me. I walked back to the guest room, packed my bag with the same deliberate calm I'd carried all morning, zipped it shut, and took one last look around the room that had once been a cage and had become, in my absence, nothing more than a museum of a person I no longer was. The shoebox was still on the bed, but I left it there. Let them have the fragments, if they wanted them. I'd already taken back what mattered. Outside, the sun was higher now, bathing the cracked driveway in that harsh, unforgiving light that shows every flaw, every detail, every truth. I tossed my bag in the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. The car hummed to life like it knew where we were going before I even touched the GPS. As I backed out of the driveway, I didn't look back. I didn't wave. I didn't wait for the door to open or for someone to come running after me. But just as I reached the end of the street, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I let it ring twice before I picked it up. A message from Casey. "What the hell did you do?" I stared at the screen, not with guilt or triumph, but with something closer to acceptance. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to explain. Nothing they could understand that I hadn't already made clear with every silent sacrifice and every quiet mile I'd driven to get here. Some debts can't be repaid in money. Some families can't be saved. And some houses don't fall apart from weather or termites or time. Sometimes, they collapse under the weight of everything left unsaid.